Welcome back to the Radio Academy podcast. I'm your host, Georgy Jameson, and this week our guest is Geoff Jein from Biscuit Jim. Geoff has been working in the radio and audio industry for many years, but he only founded Biscuit Jim last year. Recently, they've launched two big new shows, the Zoe Ball Saturday show on BBC Radio 2 and Pete Wicks' podcast for Bauer, Man Made. First, I asked Geoff to tell me the story behind the name Biscuit Jim.
Do you know what? It is the hardest thing to do, setting up a new company. Ignore the tax and VAT and everything else is easy and someone somewhere has written something. Finding a name that doesn't exist, where you can own the socials, that makes some sort of sense, and I'm not sure Biscuit Jim does, but that was the hardest thing. So actually, this wasn't the first incarnation. We were going to call it Studio 1G, was the original name, which was the first studio I ever worked in at Broadcasting House. But it also happened to be Steve Wright's studio. I'd had lunch with Steve and told him about the name, and he was going to write something for the website. I'd found an old engineer who had some photos of the studio, which are almost impossible to find. And then Steve died. And it didn't feel right. So we went back to the drawing board, and Biscuit Jim is the name that my niece has called me since she was a toddler. No one is quite sure why. She once declared, "You don't look like a Geoff," and I made the mistake of asking, "Well, what do I look like?" And Biscuit Jim was her reply. So it's been about a decade that people have called, well, my Australian family still call me Biscuit Jim, so it seemed right.
Now, you launched, as Biscuit Jim, you launched two huge products early in May in the same week, a new radio show and a podcast. We'll start with the radio. The new Zoe Ball Saturday show. I was listening back on BBC Sounds, listened to the first show, and she was talking about slot analysis. That was something that she'd learned that week. What on earth is slot analysis?
Wow. I think we can all agree that the only reason Zoe was really talking about it is it sounds slightly rude.
Yeah. Well, yes, there was that. She was having great fun with the word.
Well, I was quite surprised to hear, actually, because this has changed somewhat since the last time I was at the Beeb. We'd always have a lengthy session going through the audience demographic for that show. You know, it's been at various times a kind of PowerPoint that gets emailed you to a sort of more formal version of that. Current thinking that does now include the presenter, which is new, but I think really refreshing that the presenters are really engaging with who the opportunity audience is, who the traditional audience is. I think that's a really progressive step from the Beeb, because I think it's really important, especially for someone like Zoe who's going from breakfast to a new audience on a Saturday, just to understand, you know, where they are in their day. And I think we as producers always have a feel of what the audience is up to and where they are and what they're after. So, yeah, lots of interesting insights to come out of those meetings.
Yeah. How do you think that benefits presenters?
I think that no information is bad information, you know, in that specific station, in that specific way. You know, I've been around the block. You know, I have seen it done many, many different ways. I worked out in Australia for a couple of years, and that was quite intense. Sort of listener panels once every 6 months. They would even run sessions where they would watch listeners listening to the show.
Or like Radio Gogglebox.
Absolutely, Radio Gogglebox. They would hire a hotel room and put half a dozen listeners in a hotel room for the morning and sort of tell them to get ready for work and listen to the show and see which bits landed and which bits didn't land. And, you know, all those things at the end of the show, asking people what they remembered, and it was never what you presumed they would. So, you know, audience analysis, I find fascinating. It's a useful tool. It's in the back of your head. Personally, I don't plan anything specific to that. But, you know, an audience in a car is generally different to an audience at home, is different to an audience at work. It's just really useful information.
And an audience at the weekend is different to a breakfast show audience as well. It's not just what they're doing, but it's different people as well, isn't it?
It is. And I used to exec Claudia at Radio 2. So as much as this is Zoe coming back to Radio 2, it's also me coming back to Radio 2 on a Saturday. And yeah, the audience is different even between that 10 till 1 slot. And now we're taking over 1 to 3. So, we've only bumped on one slot, but your audience is different. It feels to me slightly less transient or in transit, I guess. Claude used to say on a bank holiday, half the text would start, "Hi, Claude, we're on our way to Cornwall." And you could... you really had that sense that the entire audience was in a car on their way somewhere.
To the coast somewhere, yeah.
Yeah, but by lunch it feels like they've arrived. And again, there's a combination of you have the numbers, you have the research. But I think anyone who's been doing this for a while also has a gut feel for what the audience is doing at that specific time. If there was a headline, I'd say our audience have arrived.
Oh, I like that. Let's talk a bit about working with talent. And we've talked about getting Zoe involved with the data of who's listening, but then how do you use that with the talent and shape what's going to go into the show? Talk me through the process of developing that new show with all those things you've talked about in mind.
I think right now that analysis hasn't necessarily shaped anything in the show. I mean, I'd say the one pretty obvious bit of audience structure is that Pick of the Pops has been on a Saturday for the last decade, and now it is moving. So one of our features very much is designed to be a 10-minute segment of pointing the audience to that new home on a Sunday afternoon, but also being a little bit of familiarity to somebody who is used to that sort of sound of clashing cymbals. Music is very familiar to a Radio 2 audience, and an excuse to play that on a Saturday afternoon, I think is just a nice nod. But it is that accepting that things move and your audience needs to find it and move around with it. So I think that's probably the only thing that is a direct nod. What we're conscious of is Saturday is a kind of hobby day. So a lot of our content is designed around cooking, gardening, music, things that we know, A, our audience are doing, but also B, they're passions of Zoe's. So where there is that connection, why wouldn't we lean into that? Yeah, not necessarily designing on the data, but again, it is just a little bit common sense, I guess.
Again, listening to Zoe's first show, there's a lovely story about cake.
My daughter's cake.
Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah, do you know what? This says an awful lot about Zoe, and we've not worked with Zoe before, so we are absolutely thrilled to be and loving it. We went out, it's the first show, we bought Zoe some flowers and some gifts, and when I got home the night before the show, I think I got home quite late, it was sort of 10:30, and our kitchen was a bomb site. I've never seen so much flour in my life. Yeah, my daughter decided she'd bake Zoe a cake. The first one hadn't been up to scratch, so Great British Bake Off style, she panicked and threw another one in. That hadn't worked either, so she was on her third Victoria sandwich when I got home. And she'd done it in 3 layers. So there was 9 sponges scattered around the kitchen at this point. And she was like, I'm happy with this one, but it's too hot to ice it now, so I'll do it when I get up in the morning. And I had to break it to her. It's the first show tomorrow. I'm going to leave here at like 6. So she did, bless her, get up at about 5:20 in the morning. Do you know what? Of everything we got Zoe for that first show, I think it was the cake that touched her most, which says much more about Zoe than it does about my daughter's cake.
It shows the warmth, though. I felt that warmth in that link when Zoe was talking about the cake. And I think that's one of the things that people like about Zoe. They're familiar, even though it's a different slot. It's still Zoe, and you've got that familiarity.
Yeah, we all felt that. I think we all felt that as an audience, actually. We felt it in the room. And I said this to Claire, who's the exec on the show, and Naomi, who's the producer. It's a real privilege to be in the room at moments like that. Zoe is, an absolute national treasure. Even 4 months away was too long to be without Zoe on the radio. It was a real privilege to see that warmth that she had for the audience and the audience had for her. I mean, I have never seen so many messages from an audience who, clearly adore her.
Hello, it's me. Oh, it's lovely to be back on a Saturday. This is where it all began for me. Back in the day when I used to sweep up and make the teas. I used to do early mornings. And then I did the slot where Rylan is. In fact, I said to producer Geoff with a G, in the week, I went, well, I'll pop in then about 2. All right, and then we'll run things through. And he went, halfway through your show, love. Might want to come in a bit earlier than that. And I made it. Thanks to Geoff with a G's daughter, Emily, who made me a cake. It is absolutely magnificent, Emily. And apparently when Geoff with a G got home last night, she'd made one, wasn't happy with it, made another. She made 3 cakes. Emily, you're an absolute queen. Thank you very much indeed. See, Nellie, my daughter, who's out at a rave on the beach last night. That's what you could be doing, clean living life. Thank you very much.
Now, in complete contrast to that, a very warm, bubbly, family-friendly, lively show, on the same week you launched a brand new podcast with Pete Wicks, which was a much more serious topic, man-made. He's very open in it, which is very Pete, but it's very raw.
Yeah, it is a very different show. I mean, Pete, on the way to being a national treasure in his own right.
But he's such a raw talent himself. And unlike Zoe, not from that traditional broadcast background. He's much newer when it comes to this. So how do you manage that?
I know what you mean. Actually, in doing the research for this program, I listened to Pete's audiobook, his autobiography. And listening to that was the moment I knew this podcast would work, because there is a vulnerability to Pete in that book for sure. But also, he talks about in his days as a recruitment consultant, sort of doing NLP courses and really learning to listen to people and understand people and think about the way you phrase a question. Well, I've worked with a lot of talent who didn't have those skills. So actually, that will be a huge asset for us. And that is exactly as it's proven to be. I should say it was never designed that these would launch in the same week. The Pete project slipped a few weeks through illness and all sorts of things. So it only ended up being confirmed they would launch 5 days apart from each other, about a fortnight out. Yeah, we didn't get much sleep that week. The podcast is man-made. The subject is conversations around male masculinity, what it means to be a good man. Pete is this long-haired, tattooed Essex boy, on paper, who's just put in a turn on Strictly Come Dancing, sequined up and fake tanned. So there is a contrast in Pete, naturally. As he says many times in the podcast, most of his best friends, most of his colleagues are women, and, relationships between men are a slightly strange thing. There's a lovely episode which hasn't dropped yet with Jake Humphrey, and they spend a lot of that talking about friendships and why, women will go out for dinner and know everything about each other's family. And there was one thing Jake said, and as he said it, I thought, God, I'm so guilty of that. That as a group of dads, he talks about school dads, and you'll go out and you'll get home and your wife will say, oh, how's Joe's dad? And you'll be like, I don't know. We didn't talk about that.
No.
We have had tears in the series so far. There are more tears to come. Pete is really good at offering a safe space. But then exactly the opposite to, and I guess this is kind of your point, exactly opposite to that studio atmosphere that you try and build for someone like Zoe, where you want it buoyant and fun and you want energy in the room. When we film Pete, we take everybody out of the room. If I could lock the cameras off and have nobody but Pete and the guest in the room, then I would. It's something we did on James Corden project we did last year, because you want that intimacy. You want that vulnerability from the guest. And I think it's increasingly hard now. Every podcast studio has cameras in it. It's all lit for broadcast. You can't have a lights dimmed, moodier atmosphere in there anymore. Everything's like bright and in your face. So as much as we can do to create an atmosphere that allows that vulnerability and that feeling that there are two people in the room having a conversation and you as the listener are the only person listening to it, creating that atmosphere, I think, was quite keen. And probably if you look at the two projects, that atmosphere is the real difference between them.
Welcome to Man Made, a podcast hosted by me, Pete Wicks, where we are going to be finding out what it takes to be a man.
Me at 16, I was wanting to make sure I was strong and look after everything. I'm going to be the man of the...
No weakness.
No weakness.
Yeah.
I'm going to be the man of the house when I'm this age. And truth, I can barely hang a picture up on the wall. Do you know what I mean?
Mate, I'm the same as that, to be fair.
So I think there's so much different stigmas on what it is to be a man.
Protector, provider, all that sort of stuff is what you
then
consider
you
to
less
be a
of a
man.
man. If you have kindness, if you're sensitive, if you're loving, that's when you're a wicked man.
So why don't men have best friends the way that women have best friends?
Because we haven't been taught to connect properly. And I'm saying that even as someone whose dad really did talk about connection, talk about love and talk about empathy. I don't want to lay the blame at the door of men because I don't think that helps the conversation. But I think we're all doing the best we can.
How much input does Pete have when it comes to the kind of guests that you book? I guess he has an incredible address book. So do you discuss it together, or had he got very definite ideas of who he wanted?
Well, I am getting some of those responses live as we record this podcast. There is a WhatsApp group and it's busy right now.
And there's pinging going on.
Well, what's interesting actually, because we'd made several assumptions going into this podcast, as you do, that people like Sam Thompson or Olivia Atwood, that he's working with quite a lot of the Bauer, certainly on Kiss, that they would be natural guests for this podcast. Both of those are guests we're not going to do in series 1. We may come back to this future series, but actually certainly with Sam, which was quite a lengthy discussion actually, what they ended up doing was Pete wanted to have the conversation with Sam about masculinity in their Staying Relevant podcast.
Yes, which is the other one they do together, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's an established podcast. And I think the feeling was that we might port some of that audience over if we have the conversation in that podcast.
Yeah.
And then there's almost no sense having it again in ours. So I think we may still return to Sam at some point in the future and do a full episode, rather than the shorter piece that they've done in Staying Relevant. We've done a Vicky Patterson episode, who is, one of Pete's longest friends. It's not out yet, but I can tell you that Vicky starts crying about 5 minutes in and doesn't stop. I wasn't expecting it to be as emotional as it was. I think Pete tried to give us a heads up. This one might be, but we ran out of tissues. It's just the vulnerability. And I think it was the connection between the two. I mean, I think you'll see this on the video when we release it, but Pete was very deliberately avoiding eye contact in that episode. And he says it at one point that I think because she's so emotional and they are such good friends, he just feared that if he started crying, there'd be nobody to ask the questions. I was really touched by that episode, actually, because they share an agent. Pete and Vicky are both with Mockingbird. And I did send an email afterwards to say that was, it was an incredible performance. Yeah. It's a side of Vicky I haven't seen before. I think I said in my note, I would quite happily play this to both my teenage daughter and my teenage son. I think they would both learn a lot from Vicky, and kind of what we're after with the podcast. We talked about audience data with Zoe. What we know about Pete's audience is that it's very female skewed. And so we are doing a podcast for men with a presenter who we know is female skewed, which sort of doesn't make sense on paper. What came up in the Caitlin Moran conversation is that she also wrote a book about men to an audience who is almost entirely female skewed. And what we've both learnt through those projects is that we are reaching men through with it, that we have an audience who is listening to our podcast and then recommending it to their brothers, husbands, sons, colleagues, and that's actually quite a powerful outreach. We're seeing it as well in the comments of the podcast. We're seeing an awful lot of, I thought this was incredible, I've given it to my son to listen to. It's probably one of those examples where if you took this purely on the insight and the data, you'd never make it. But actually, it's been a really effective tool that doesn't make any sense on paper. With both of these projects, there's an obvious gut feel to them. The insight and the data is hugely useful to us. But if you don't already know that Zoe's a national treasure, the insight is only going to help you so much.
A big thank you to Geoff Jein from Biscuit Jim, and you'll be able to hear more from Geoff later on in the year with some extra audio from our chat, which will make one of our Summer Shorts episodes in August. The Radio Academy Festival is on Wednesday the 17th of September, and tickets are now on sale. There's a freelancer early bird discount and concession prices for low earners. For all the details you need and to book tickets, go to radioacademy.org/festival. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Radio Academy podcast wherever you get your pods so you never miss an episode. We really appreciate it. Next week, our guest is Scout Zofia Bolton from Prison Association Radio, who tells me about her incredible story and that double gold Arias win. I'll see you next week.